What would you do if the man who humiliated you in front of 20 people, called you ignorant, got you fired on the spot, and walked away laughing, ended up needing you to survive? Rafael Vargas spent 14 years mastering every bottle, every vintage, every handshake in Seattle's finest dining room. One night, one ruthless billionaire, and 30 seconds were all it took to destroy it. But Raphael wasn't just a sommelier. He was patient, he was precise, and he had been quietly building something nobody knew about. Stay with me, because the moment Preston Hargrove tried to buy a case of wine for his gala is the moment this story gets truly satisfying.
The last vintage.
What would you do if the man who humiliated you in front of 20 people, called you ignorant, got you fired on the spot, and walked away laughing, ended up needing you to survive? Rafael Vargas spent 14 years mastering every bottle, every vintage, every handshake in Seattle's finest dining room. One night, one ruthless billionaire, and 30 seconds were all it took to destroy it. But Raphael wasn't just a sommelier. He was patient, he was precise, and he had been quietly building something nobody knew about. Stay with me, because the moment Preston Hargrove tried to buy a case of wine for his gala is the moment this story gets truly satisfying.
I learned the name of every wine before I learned how to drive. My father came from Colombia with $40 in his pocket and a dream of working in restaurants. He washed dishes in the same place for 11 years. I grew up surrounded by wine crates, the smell of garlic, and the sound of a kitchen that never stops. There was no glamour in any of it. There was work. But I loved it, every single detail of it. At 19, I started as a barback at a bistro in Capitol Hill. By 23, I was the youngest certified sommelier by the Court of Master Sommeliers in the state of Washington. At 28, I walked through the doors of Caravel for the first time, Seattle's most respected restaurant. 3 Michelin stars, 4-month waiting list. I stayed for 14 years. In those 14 years, I built the Caravel wine cellar from the ground up. When I arrived, there were 280 labels. By the time the story I'm about to tell you happened, there were 1,847. Every single one chosen by me, every producer visited in person, every allocation negotiated directly. The owner of Caravel, a man named Scott Tillman, used to tell guests that the wine cellar was the heart of the restaurant. He was right. And that heart beat with my name on it. But Scott never said that publicly. Never put my name on the menu. Never mentioned me in interviews for Wine Spectator, the Seattle Times, Food and Wine magazine. In the restaurant's official credits, I was listed as wine director, a beautiful title. No face, no story. I accepted it. That was my nature. I wasn't working for the spotlight. I was working for the wines. On the evening of March 14th, Caravel received a private dining room reservation for 20 guests. The host was Preston Hargrove, 56 years old. Founder of a private equity fund headquartered in San Francisco, with an office in Seattle, a Forbes profile, and the kind of energy that fills a room before he even enters it. The type of man who books entire restaurants for client dinners and calls it work. I had served Hargrove 3 times before. I knew what he liked: Grand Chateau Bordeaux, older vintages, labels that impressed the table more than the palate. He didn't drink wine. He displayed wine. That evening, he had requested a special selection in advance. I spent 2 days preparing. I chose 7 labels. I wrote personalized tasting notes for each one. I arrived at 6 in the morning to check the service temperatures. Everything was perfect. The problems started with the 3rd wine. I had poured a Chateau Pitch and Baron 2015, an impeccable choice, in perfect harmony with the lamb dish the kitchen had prepared. Hargrove picked up the glass, swirled it, smelled it, drank. He set it back on the table with force. "This wine is flawed," he said. I approached carefully. I poured a small amount into my tasting glass, analyzed it. The wine was perfect. Solid structure, elegant tannins, long finish, no flaw of any kind. With all due respect, Sir, the wine is in excellent condition. I can open a second bottle if you prefer, but I believe he didn't let me finish. Are you telling me I don't know what I'm drinking? His voice rose. All 20 people at the table stopped talking. I have a cellar in Napa, with bottles worth more than your annual salary. Don't tell me what is or isn't a flaw. I stayed calm. Mr. Hargrove, I can verify. Get the manager. Now. Scott Tillman arrived in 2 minutes. Hargrove spoke for 4. I listened in silence. The words he used were incompetent, arrogant, not remotely qualified, and finally, either he leaves tonight or I never come back. And I will make sure none of my contacts ever come back either. Scott Tillman owned a 3 Michelin star restaurant. He was also a businessman who knew exactly how much money Preston Hargrove represented per year he looked at me. There was genuine discomfort on his face. But there was also a decision already made. Rafael, I need to ask you to end your shift tonight. I removed my jacket, folded it carefully, placed it on the counter. I didn't say a word. I left through the back door, the way I had always entered. The cold Seattle air met me outside. I stopped on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the sky. 14 years, folded in 30 seconds. That night, at home, I opened a bottle I had saved for years. A Walla Walla Syrah from 2011, from a small winery I had visited personally. Years earlier, when I was beginning to think about something that didn't yet have a name. As I drank, I didn't think about Hargrove. I didn't think about Scott. I thought about something that had begun 2 years earlier, quietly, without anyone knowing. Because Rafael Vargas hadn't spent 14 years just serving wine. He had spent 14 years learning how the Pacific Northwest wine market truly worked. Who produced, who owed, who was for sale without knowing it yet, and it was time to use that knowledge. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30, same time as always. There was no restaurant to go to, no cellar to check, no reservations to study. There was only silence and a clarity I hadn't expected to feel. For 14 years, I had served other people's work. The wines I chose had built Caravel's reputation. The relationships I had built with producers in Oregon, in Walla Walla, in the Columbia Valley, those relationships had my name on them. Not the restaurants. Scott Tillman had fired me, but there was no way to fire what I knew. I opened my laptop. I got to work. 2 years before the dismissal, during a sourcing trip to Walla Walla, I had visited a winery called Cascade Ridge. It was small. 17 acres. Syrah, Cabernet Franc, and a Grenache that was, in my opinion, the most underrated wine in the state of Washington. The owner, a man named Harold Benton, was 73 years old and had planted every vine with his own hands back in the 80s. In the last 2 years, Harold had been ill. His children had no interest in wine. The operation had slowed down. His debt to the local bank had grown. I knew this because Harold had told me personally during that visit, and because I had stayed in touch since then, not as strategy, but because I genuinely cared about him. But I was also a professional, and I knew how to recognize what that situation represented. 3 weeks after the dismissal, I drove to Walla Walla. I brought a bottle of the 2019 Grenache that Harold had given me on that first visit. We sat at the same wooden table in the cellar. I drank slowly. I talked even slower. Harold was tired. The bank had sent the second formal notice. The debt was $340,000, small for a fund like Hargrove's. Enormous for a 73-year-old man with compromised lungs and children living in Phoenix and Denver. I don't know what's going to happen to this land, he said. I don't want to sell to some corporation. They'll pull out the vines and plant apples. I set my glass down on the table. Harold, I need to tell you something I've been thinking about for 2 years. The mechanism I used isn't widely known outside the financial sector. When a debtor, whether an individual or a company, owes money to a bank, that bank will often sell the debt on the secondary market, especially when it considers the risk of default to be high. The debt is sold for a fraction of the original value. The buyer assumes the right to collect the full amount or to negotiate directly with the debtor. I had researched this in the months before the dismissal, when I had started to notice Harold's situation deteriorating. I had consulted a banking law attorney in Seattle. I had understood exactly how it worked. Harold's debt to the regional bank in Walla Walla, $340,000, had been internally classified as a watch list account. With the right documentation and the right approach, it was possible to acquire it. I didn't have $340,000, but I had something different. I had 2 years of relationship with a silent investor named Elena Voss, a former tech executive from Portland, who had reached out to me 3 years earlier. After reading an article I had written about the untapped potential of Columbia Valley wines, she wanted to enter the industry. She had been waiting for the right opportunity. I made one phone call. She said yes within 48 hours. The negotiation with the bank took 3 weeks. They sold the debt for $198,000, 58 cents on the dollar. Elena came in with $180,000. I came in with $18,000, savings from 14 years that had gone untouched because I had always lived below my means. We became Harold Benton's formal creditors. But we didn't go to collect. We went to make a different kind of offer. Instead of demanding repayment of the debt, we proposed a restructuring. Harold would transfer 60% of Cascade Ridge in exchange for the complete cancellation of the debt and an additional investment of $120,000 to modernize the operation. He would keep 40%, continue living on the property for as long as he wanted, and receive a monthly salary for the rest of his life. Harold cried when he read the contract. I thought I was going to lose everything, he said. You're not going to lose anything, I told him. You're going to watch this land grow in the 18 months that followed. I worked harder than at any other point in my life. We modernized the winemaking process. We hired a young enologist from UC Davis who had trained in Burgundy. We cut production in half, fewer bottles, absolutely superior quality. I used every relationship I had built in 14 years at Caravel. Distributors who knew me by first name. Importers who had asked my advice for years. Editors of specialized publications who knew my palate was reliable. None of them knew I was now co-owner of Cascade Ridge, not out of strategic secrecy, simply because I had learned, in 14 years of silent service, that the work speaks louder than any announcement. I let the wine speak first. In October, Wine Spectator published a tasting note. Cascade Ridge Grenache 2022, 96 points. One of the most compelling expressions of Grenache in the Pacific Northwest. Precise, layered, and utterly original. That wasn't the only one. Wine Advocate gave it 94. The Seattle Times wrote half a page. Food and Wine put us on their list of 10 American producers to watch in 2026. The phone didn't stop ringing. Distributors who had never heard of Cascade Ridge wanted allocations. Restaurants in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. A Japanese importer called 3 times in the same week. I answered every call with the same calm I had brought to 14 years of service. I had learned that the best response to other people's urgency is your own patience. In November, I received an email through the winery's website. The subject line read, Wine Inquiry, Private Gala Event, 200 Guests, Seattle. The sender was an assistant named Courtney Marsh. She was writing on behalf of her employer, who was organizing a charitable gala dinner at the Four Seasons in Seattle. They needed 24 cases of wine, preferably a high-quality Grenache or Syrah from the Pacific Northwest. They had read about Cascade Ridge. They wanted to know about availability and pricing. I responded personally. I confirmed availability. I asked for the name of the event host in order to formalize the proposal. The reply came back in 12 minutes. The event is organized by the office of Preston Hargrove. I closed my laptop. I sat in silence for a moment. Then I opened it again, and I started writing. I wrote the response very carefully. I confirmed that Cascade Ridge would be pleased to supply the wine for the event. I included the price per case, premium, but fair for the quality. I attached our technical sheet, the published tasting notes, and an introductory letter from the winery. The letter began like this: Cascade Ridge Winery was founded in 1987 by Harold Benton in Walla Walla, Washington. In 2024, it came under the co-direction of Rafael Vargas, former wine director of Caravel Restaurant in Seattle, and Elena Voss. Our philosophy is simple. Wine tells the story of the land and of the person who tends it. I signed it with my full name. And I waited. Courtney Marsh's reply took 2 days. When it came, it was different. It was no longer the assistant writing. It was Hargrove directly. Mr. Vargas, I wasn't aware you were associated with Cascade Ridge, given the circumstances of our last interaction. I'm not sure this is the right fit for our event. We'll explore other options. I read it twice. I put my phone down on the table. Then I called Elena. He declined, I said. We expected that. She replied, yes, I agreed. But his email is going to be useful. Because what Preston Hargrove didn't know was that I had forwarded the entire exchange, including his reply, to 3 wine journalists with whom I had a personal relationship. Not as a complaint. As context for a larger story, they were already writing about Cascade Ridge's rise. The story ran in the Wine Industry Advisor 2 weeks later. The title was, From the Floor to the Vineyard, How a Sommelier Built the Most Talked About Winery in Washington State. Hargrove's email appeared in the 5th paragraph as an example of how the wine industry still underestimates floor professionals. No accusations, just documented facts. Just the truth, told with precision. Caravel lost its exclusive supply contract with 3 distributors that month. All of them had read the article. All of them had known me for years. Scott Tillman called me personally. I didn't answer. Hargrove never reached out again. And Harold Benton, sitting on the porch of the house, where he had planted every vine decades earlier, opened a bottle of the 2020 to Greenock on a December afternoon and sent me a photo from his phone. Just the photo. No text. It didn't need any.
Rafael Vargas didn't shout, he didn't sue, he didn't go on social media. He did something far more powerful. He took every year of knowledge that nobody had valued and built something that nobody could take from him. Preston Hargrove tried to erase a sommelier. He ended up helping create the owner of the most awarded winery in the Pacific Northwest. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge makes no noise at all. It just shows up in an article with your name in the title. And speaking of building something quietly while nobody's paying attention, the next story is about a university professor who spent 22 years shaping the best finance professionals in the country. When a billionaire former student tried to destroy him, he discovered he had 347 former students, and some of them were in exactly the right places. Don't go anywhere. The real power isn't in how much noise you make when you're knocked down. It's in how much knowledge you accumulated while nobody was watching. Rafael didn't win in spite of 14 years of silent service. He won because of them. 22 years. That's how long Professor Raymond Osei spent in the same classroom at the same university in Raleigh, North Carolina, turning average students into exceptional professionals. 3 of them became CFOs of S&P 500 companies. 1 became a federal regulator, and 1 became a billionaire who decided that the man who gave him a C- didn't deserve a pension. What Brent Coulter didn't calculate was that Raymond had been quietly teaching his students something that never appeared on any syllabus: loyalty. Stay with me.
The extra credit.
I came into academia by accident. My original plan was Wall Street. I was 26 years old, had an MBA from Duke, and 2 job offers waiting for me in New York. On an afternoon in March, a professor asked me to cover a corporate finance class while he was sick. I walked into that room. I saw 32 faces looking back at me. I started talking. 2 hours later, I walked out of that classroom knowing I was never going to New York. There was something in that space that no trading floor could offer, the feeling of watching someone understand something for the very first time. The exact moment a complex idea becomes clear inside a young mind. I was addicted to it before I even finished that first class. 22 years later, I still was. My course was Advanced Corporate Finance. It wasn't a popular course. It was known on campus as the filter, the class that separated students who truly understood finance from those who simply memorized formulas. My failure rate was consistently the highest in the department. My students' CFA pass rate after taking my course was the highest in the university. Students feared me before they knew me. Afterward, they respected me. Some of them, over the years, would reach out long after graduation to tell me that my class had changed their careers. I kept every one of those messages in a folder on my computer that I had never shown anyone. In 22 years, that folder held 347 emails. Brent Coulter had been my student in the fall semester of 2009. I remembered him clearly, not because he was exceptional, but because he was the kind of student who confused confidence with competence. Intelligent, no question, articulate, charismatic. But with a relationship to effort that I recognized immediately, he wanted the results without the process. He got a C in the course. He filed a formal complaint with the department. The coordinator asked me to review the grade. I reviewed it. I confirmed it. Brent walked out of my office for the last time without looking back. 15 years later, he had founded a fintech company called Clear Vault, a digital asset management platform valued at $2.3 billion after its last investment round. His face was on magazine covers. His name was on lists. And apparently, he was still thinking about that C. In February, I was summoned to a meeting with the dean of the business department. Also present were the vice provost for academic affairs and the university's HR director. 3 people for a meeting that had been described in the email as a routine conversation about resource allocation. It was not a routine conversation. There was an open administrative investigation against me. The allegations were 3: outdated assessment methodology, a hostile classroom environment for students, and resistance to curriculum modernization initiatives. I asked for the documents supporting the allegations. I was told they would be shared at a later time. I asked for the names of the students who had complained. I was told the process was confidential. I asked who had initiated the investigation. There was a pause. The dean adjusted his collar and said it had been a combination of internal feedback and concerns raised by external university partners. I knew immediately what that meant. 3 weeks before the investigation, the university had publicly announced a $3 million donation from Brent Coulter and the ClearVault Foundation. The donation was designated for the creation of a new FinTech Innovation Center, the ClearVault Center for Financial Innovation, within the business department. Alongside the announcement, Brent had given an interview to the university newspaper. At one point, the reporter asked about his experience as a student. He answered, and I am quoting directly, "There were professors who inspired me to think differently, and there were professors who simply didn't keep up with the evolution of the industry. The finance world of 2024 has nothing to do with what was being taught 15 years ago." He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. Everyone in the department understood. I left the meeting and went straight to my car. I didn't start the engine. I sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes. I wasn't angry. I was calculating. There was one thing that 22 years of teaching corporate finance had taught me better than anything else. Every situation has a structure. Every problem has variables. And before you act, you need to map exactly what is at stake. What was at stake for me was specific and urgent. I was 1 semester away from full retirement benefits, 25 years of service, lifetime health coverage, a pension at 80% of my final salary. If the investigation resulted in termination for cause before that mark, I would lose everything, not part of it, everything. Brent Coulter knew that. He had studied finance with me. He knew exactly how to calculate the timing of a strike. But there was something he had forgotten. He had studied with me for one semester. I had studied him for 22 years of his career, and I had studied with the same attention each of the 347 former students who had written to me over the years. That night I opened the folder on my computer. 347 emails. I read every single one in chronological order, from the oldest to the most recent. It took 4 hours. I wasn't looking for emotional support. I was doing what I had always taught my students to do when facing a complex problem. Map your available assets before defining your strategy. When I finished, I had a list of 17 names highlighted. 3 were CFOs at S&P 500 companies. 1 was a compliance director at a regional bank. 1 was a senior partner at a labor law firm in Durham. 1 was an investigative journalist at the Financial Times. And 1, the name I had saved for last, was Sandra Ye. Sandra had been my student in 2014. She had earned an A. She had written to me 3 years later to say that my course had been the reason she had chosen to go into the regulatory sector instead of the private market. In 2026, Sandra Ye was Director of Digital Market Supervision at the Federal Trade Commission. And Brent Coulter's ClearVault had a regulatory review pending at the FTC for 4 months. I called Sandra on a Friday morning. I hadn't spoken to her in 2 years. She picked up on the second ring. Professor Osei. Her voice had the same direct tone I remembered from the classroom. I was wondering when you'd call. I was silent for a second. How did you know? Because I've been working in conflict of interest analysis for 6 years, she replied. And when I saw the announcement of the ClearVault donation to your university, I made the connection immediately. Brent Coulter was your student. The donation happened 3 weeks before an administrative investigation against you. That has a name in the regulatory world, Professor. What name? I asked, although I already knew the answer. Undue influence, she said, using financial power to pressure an institution into making a decision that benefits the donor. She paused. I can't act because of you, Professor. That needs to be clear. But if there is a regulatory hearing about ClearVault's practices, and there is one being prepared, voluntary testimony from independent experts is always welcome. On the following Monday, I met with Victor Salinas, senior partner at the labor law firm I had identified in my list of former students. He had been my student in 2011. He had earned a B+. He had written to me in 2019 to say that the analytical framework I taught had changed the way he built cases. Now he was reading the documentation of the administrative investigation against me with the focus of someone who recognizes a familiar pattern. This is a setup, he said without looking up from the papers. The allegations are vague enough to survive a first appeal, but specific enough to justify a preventive suspension. Whoever wrote this knew what they were doing. How much time do I have? I asked. The university will want to close this before the end of the semester. They probably have a 60-day timeline. He closed the folder. But 60 days is enough time if we act now. What do we need? I asked. Documentation of everything. Every class, every assessment, every communication with students over the last 5 years. And we need to prove that the investigation was initiated as a direct result of the donation, not independently of it. I opened my briefcase and placed 22 years of impeccably organized academic records on the table. Victor looked at the stack. He smiled for the first time. Have you always been like this? I teach corporate finance, I replied. Documentation is not optional. While Victor was building the labor case, I did something nobody expected. I called the other 16 names on my list. I didn't ask any of them for anything. I simply told them what was happening, with precision, without drama, with the documented facts. And I asked whether any of them had anything relevant to share about ClearVault or about Brent Coulter. The responses came in over the course of a week. Two of the CFOs had been approached by Clearvault for partnerships that they later discovered involved questionable accounting practices. One of them had documented the approach internally and had never known what to do with it. The compliance director at the regional bank had rejected a Clearvault proposal 2 years earlier over concerns about the structure of their digital asset custody and had kept all the correspondence. The Financial Times journalist had been investigating Clearvault for 3 months. He was looking for sources. In 10 days, I had gone from being the target of an administrative investigation to being the central piece of an information network that 3 separate entities needed. The FTC regulatory hearing on Clearvault was scheduled for April. I had been invited as a voluntary expert witness, not as a party, not as a whistleblower, but as a professor with 22 years of experience in corporate finance and a direct knowledge of the market practices under investigation. Victor Salinas prepared me for 2 weeks, not to spin anything, to be precise. There is an enormous difference between the two, and it is exactly that difference that I had been teaching my students for decades. On the morning of the hearing, I woke up at 4:30. I dressed carefully. I had coffee in silence. Before leaving the house, I opened my laptop and reread the last email in the folder, the most recent one, received 3 days earlier. It was from a former student who had written simply to tell me she had just been promoted to VP of Finance at a healthcare company in Charlotte, and that the risk analysis framework I had taught in 2018 had been the foundation of the presentation that had secured her promotion. I closed the laptop. I walked out the door. I testified for 94 minutes. I did not accuse Brent Coulter directly. I didn't need to. I presented a technical analysis of Clearvault's asset custody structure, using exactly the frameworks I had taught for 22 years, and demonstrated, with publicly available documentation, 3 points of inconsistency between the company's regulatory filings and its reported operational practices. The FTC commissioners asked 23 questions. I answered every one with the precision of someone who had spent decades explaining complex concepts to people who needed to understand them completely. When I finished, one of the commissioners, a white-haired woman who had not smiled once during the entire hearing, looked at me for a moment. "Professor Osei, have you ever considered working as a regulatory consultant?" "I have been considering finishing my semester," I replied. There was a silence. And then she smiled. 3 weeks after the hearing, Victor Salinas reached out to the university. The letter was direct. It documented with precise chronological detail the sequence of events, the Clearvault donation, Brent Coulter's interview with the university newspaper, the opening of the administrative investigation, the absence of any formal student complaint in records accessed through a Freedom of Information Act request. It concluded with a clear legal analysis. The investigation constituted indirect retaliation motivated by external donor influence in violation of the university's own internal policies and the labor laws of the state of North Carolina. The letter also mentioned in passing that Clearvault was under active investigation by the FTC. The dean responded within 48 hours. He wanted a meeting. Victor replied that informal meetings were no longer the appropriate format. "Please send a formal written proposal." The proposal arrived in 5 days. The agreement had 4 points. First, the administrative investigation closed immediately, with no permanent record in my file. Second, compensation equivalent to 2 semesters of salary. Third, full retirement benefits move forward by 1 semester with no penalty. Fourth, and this was the point that Victor had inserted and that I had approved without hesitation, the creation of a permanent endowed chair in corporate finance bearing my name, funded from existing departmental resources. The Raymond Osei Endowed Chair in Corporate Finance would be filled by a professor I would personally help select. I signed the agreement on a Thursday afternoon with the same pen I had used to sign my original contract 22 years earlier. I had kept the pen. I never knew why. That afternoon, I understood why. As for Clearvault, the FTC investigation resulted in a $47 million fine and a requirement for complete restructuring of the custody model. Brent Coulter stepped down as CEO in June, citing personal reasons. The $3 million donation to the university was returned at the request of the university board itself, which preferred not to maintain an association with a company under federal investigation. The Clear Vault Center for Financial Innovation never opened. The Raymond Osei Endowed Chair did. On the first day of class of the following semester, the new professor walked into the room, looked at 38 students, and said exactly what I had told him to say. This course has the highest failure rate in the department, and it will change your career, not in spite of that, because of it. I know this because I was sitting in the last row. I had asked for permission to sit in on the first class. Some places, when you leave them, you don't abandon. You just change seats.
Raymond Osei spent 22 years building something Brent Coulter was never able to buy: real trust. Not the kind of trust that comes from a $3 million check, the kind that comes from showing up semester after semester and doing the work with integrity. When the moment came that he needed that trust back, it was there, in 347 emails, in 17 phone calls, in 94 minutes of testimony. You never know when what you planted is going to grow, but if you plant it well, it will grow at exactly the right time. And speaking of planting something that nobody sees growing, the last story today is about a man who lost everything on a Tuesday afternoon: his career, his dream, and the identity he had built since he was 8 years old. And he spent 10 years in silence rebuilding until the day the university that had discarded him tried to use his image without asking permission. Calvin Merritt didn't go alone. There were 14 of them. Stay until the end, because this ending you will not forget. What you build with integrity cannot be bought or destroyed by money. It can be threatened, it can be shaken, but when the pressure comes, it reveals exactly how solid it was. Raymond didn't win because he had power. He won because he had invested in people, and people, unlike financial assets, pay compound interest. Calvin Merritt was 21 years old when a torn labrum ended everything he had worked for since he was 8. No surgery covered, no compensation, no goodbye, just a box of his things left outside the athletic facility on a Tuesday afternoon. He spent the next 10 years rebuilding himself from zero, not with anger, but with purpose. And then, one morning, he opened his phone and saw his own face on a billboard for a national sportswear campaign. Nobody had asked, nobody had called, nobody had paid. That was the last mistake Gary Stanhope ever made as athletic director. Stay with me.
The shoulder that remembered.
I learned to run before I learned to read. That's not an exaggeration. My mother used to say I'd slip out the back door and disappear into the yard before I could even form complete sentences. There was something about movement, about speed, about the precision of a body in space. That made sense to me in a way the static world never did. At 8 years old, I joined the flag football team at school. By 12, I was already the starting wide receiver on the junior neighborhood team in Oklahoma City. At 18, I had 3 Division I scholarship offers from universities across the country. I chose to stay close to home. I chose the state university. 4 years of full scholarship, NFL draft plans, an agent already talking to my family, a future that felt as solid as the concrete of the stadium, where I trained every single morning at 6. Then came the Tuesday in October of my junior year. The tackle was legal. Nothing out of the ordinary. I had run that route hundreds of times. Post route, cut toward the middle of the field, reception at the exact moment the safety arrived. The problem wasn't the impact. It was the angle. My right shoulder rotated a few degrees beyond what any human joint was designed to handle. I heard the sound before I felt the pain. 3 days later, the diagnosis confirmed it. Complete superior labrum tear, type 4 slap lesion with rotator cuff involvement. The university's orthopedic surgeon was direct. Immediate surgery, 12 to 18 months of rehabilitation, return to competitive contact sport, highly unlikely. I was 21 years old. The athletic coordinator visited me in the hospital. He stayed 8 minutes. He said the university was rooting for my recovery. He left a card with the athletic department's phone number. 3 weeks later, I received a formal letter informing me that my athletic scholarship would not be renewed for the following year, as I was not in condition to compete. On a Tuesday afternoon, I found a box with my things from the locker room left outside the entrance to the athletic complex. There was nobody there to hand it over in person. The surgery was covered by the basic insurance the scholarship included. The rehabilitation was not. My mother worked double shifts for 4 months to pay for the physical therapy sessions. My father drove 40 minutes to the clinic and waited outside every single time I had a session, because the parking lot was paid and he couldn't spend the money. I saw all of it, every detail, and something was crystallizing inside me during those months of rehabilitation. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and more lasting than anger. Understanding. Understanding of how the college athletic system truly worked. How athletes were assets while they produced and discarded when they stopped producing. How scholarships were instruments of extraction, not of development. How nobody had explained any of this to me at 18 years old when I signed the papers. I decided I was going to understand everything. Every detail, every clause, every right I had signed away without knowing it. I started studying sports law on my own. Then I enrolled in night courses in athletic rehabilitation. Then I opened my own clinic. It took 10 years, but I had time. Merritt Sports Recovery opened in Oklahoma City in 2019, specialized in the rehabilitation of collegiate and professional athletes with shoulder and knee injuries, exactly the injuries the system had taught me to understand in the most painful way possible. In 5 years, I had treated more than 400 athletes. 23 of them had been discarded by university programs with poorly treated injuries. For each of those 23, I had made a point of understanding the full story, not just the clinical one, but the institutional one. It wasn't strategy. It was empathy. It was recognizing in each of them what I had been at 21 years old. But over those 5 years, I had been accumulating something I hadn't planned to accumulate. Documented medical declarations, institutional correspondence, records of denied treatments, discharge protocols that repeated themselves with a regularity that was no coincidence. Everything saved, everything organized. With the discipline of someone who had learned, in the most expensive way possible, that documentation is survival. It was a patient who showed me first. A Monday morning in January, I was doing the initial assessment of a young linebacker who had been released from the State University football program 3 weeks earlier. He walked into the clinic with his phone in his hand and said before he even sat down, "Did you see the billboard?" I hadn't. He turned his phone toward me. It was a national advertising campaign from Proform Athletics, one of the largest sports equipment brands in the country. The campaign was called Built from the Game, and it used historical images of American collegiate athletes to celebrate what they called the essence of American sport. In the central image of the billboard, which was being displayed in 32 states, on digital platforms and on physical panels in 16 cities, there was a wide receiver making a catch in the end zone. The number on the jersey was 17. I had worn number 17 for 3 years. The angle of the photo, the posture of the body, the stadium in the background. I recognized myself before I even read the caption. There was no name, no credit, no contract, no payment. Just my image, used nationally, to sell products for a company that generated $800 million a year in revenue. That night I didn't sleep, not from anger, from research. In 2021, the NCAA had been forced by the Supreme Court to allow collegiate athletes to monetize their names, images, and likenesses, what became known as NIL rights, name, image, and likeness. The decision had permanently changed the landscape of American collegiate sport. But there was a question the decision hadn't fully resolved. What happened to images of athletes captured before 2021, during the period when NIL rights didn't formally exist? Who controlled them? Who could commercialize them? The answer, according to most contracts signed by collegiate athletes before 2021, including the one I had signed at 18 years old, was the university. But there was a clear limitation in those contracts that very few people had read carefully. The transfer of image rights was valid for institutional and non-commercial use only. Use in third-party advertising campaigns with explicit commercial purposes required separate and specific authorization from the athlete. Proform Athletics was not the university. It was a private company. The campaign was explicitly commercial, and nobody had asked for my authorization. I had signed a contract at 18 years old without understanding what I was signing. But now I was 34. And I knew how to read every single line. I called Iris Nakamura on a Tuesday morning. Iris had been a collegiate athlete herself, swimming, University of Texas, and had become one of the most respected attorneys in sports law and NIL rights in the American Southwest. I had met her at an athletic rehabilitation conference 2 years earlier. We had exchanged cards. There was something in the way she talked about collegiate athletes that told me she understood the system from the inside. She read the documents I sent her within 24 hours. She called me back with a single sentence. "Calvin, you're not the only one." She had received 3 similar inquiries in the last week. Athletes from other sports whose historical images appeared in the same Proform Athletics campaign. The university had apparently licensed an entire image archive to the company, without individually verifying the contracts of each athlete. "How many do you think are in the same situation?" I asked. "I'm still mapping it," she said. "But the campaign uses images of at least 40 athletes. We need to locate as many as we can." In 2 weeks, Iris had located 26 athletes. I had contributed 8 names, former athletes who had come through my clinic and whose stories I knew. Some I had stayed in touch with. Others I located through collegiate athlete networks in the state. Of the 26 people located, 14 agreed to participate in a class action. The other 12 had various reasons for not moving forward. Fear of exposure, sensitive professional situations, simply not wanting to relive that period of their lives. I respected every decision, but the 14 who said yes were enough. Iris was direct in the first collective meeting over video conference. The case has 3 pillars. First, unauthorized commercial use of image, in violation of the specific terms of the original contracts. Second, the university licensed the rights without verifying the individual contractual limitations, which constitutes institutional negligence. Third, the non-compete clause that some of you signed, preventing legal action against the university for matters related to the athletic scholarship, was declared broadly invalid by the Oklahoma Court of Appeals in 2024 for contracts entered into before 2018. There was silence on the call. Then someone asked, "And did Gary Stanhope know all of this?" Iris looked directly at the camera. Gary Stanhope signed the licensing contract with Proform Athletics personally, in March of last year. Gary Stanhope had been the university's athletic director for 12 years. He was the kind of administrator who appeared in every victory photo and in none of the crisis photos. He had presided over 3 conference championships, 2 expansions of the athletic complex, and a 340% increase in department revenue during his tenure. He had also presided quietly over the policy of discarding injured athletes that I had been documenting for 5 years through my clinic. There was nothing illegal about that policy. It was simply cruel, systematic, and perfectly within the limits of what the system allowed. But the Proform Athletics contract was different. The Pro-Form Athletics contract had his name on the last page, and it contained a clause that Iris had highlighted in yellow before sending us the document. The institution declares that it has obtained all necessary authorizations from the individuals depicted in the licensed images. Gary Stanhope had signed a false declaration. The action was filed on a Thursday in March. 14 plaintiffs, 3 defendants, the university, the athletic department, and Gary Stanhope personally, for having signed a contractual declaration stating that authorizations existed that did not exist. Iris had built the case with the precision of someone who knows every trap in the system she is challenging. There was no unnecessary emotion in the documents. There were facts, dates, contracts, images with metadata, campaign broadcast records, estimated revenue spreadsheets from Pro-Form Athletics for that specific campaign. The compensation request was $4.1 million, calculated based on market rates for image licensing in national sportswear campaigns, multiplied by the number of athletes and the broadcast period. It wasn't revenge. It was fair pricing for what had been taken. Pro-Form Athletics withdrew from the process in 45 days. They didn't want the public burden of a trial with 14 former collegiate athletes telling their stories in an Oklahoma courtroom. Their legal department had calculated that the reputational cost far exceeded the value of a settlement. They paid $2.8 million to the 14 athletes, distributed proportionally based on the broadcast time of each image. My share was $340,000. Exactly, by a coincidence that was no coincidence at all. The amount Harold Benton owed to the bank when Rafael Vargas found him in Walla Walla. The world is small when you pay attention. The university, to avoid the separate trial against the department, offered an additional settlement, implementation of a mandatory individual authorization verification protocol before any licensing of former athlete images, and the creation of a fund of $180,000 designated to cover medical rehabilitation for injured collegiate athletes who did not have adequate coverage. I read that clause 3 times. A fund to cover rehabilitation for injured athletes. Exactly what my mother had worked double shifts to pay for 13 years earlier. I signed the agreement without hesitation. Gary Stanhope announced his early retirement 2 weeks later. The official statement cited personal and family reasons. Nobody who had followed the process believed it for a single second. The other 12 athletes, who had chosen not to participate in the action, reached out to me after the settlement was made public. There was no bitterness. There was only an honest conversation about what had happened and what was possible going forward. For 3 of them, we were able to include a retroactive clause in the agreement that extended some benefits even without formal participation. Iris had negotiated that quietly, without announcing it, because it was the right thing to do. With my share of the settlement, I did 3 things. I paid off my mother's mortgage entirely. A 3-bedroom house in Oklahoma City, where she had lived for 22 years, and that was 18 months from being paid off, but that weighed on her as if it were still the very first day. I expanded Merritt's sports recovery with a 2nd location, specialized exclusively in collegiate athletes released due to injury, with a care protocol that included not only physical rehabilitation, but guidance on contractual rights. And I put a framed piece on the wall of the clinic, not a photo of me making that catch in the end zone. A photo taken on the day the action was filed. 14 people on the courthouse steps, early in the morning, before any outcome was guaranteed. 14 expressions I knew well. The expression of people who had decided that this time they were not walking away in silence. Below the photo, I wrote a single line in simple letters. The shoulder remembered. So did we.
Calvin Merritt didn't go back to get revenge on Gary Stanhope. He went back because 14 people deserved to be seen, and because the system that had ignored them needed to learn that ignoring people has a cost. He didn't use anger. He used documentation, time and the clarity of someone who had spent 10 years understanding exactly what had been done to him. Sometimes the most powerful victory isn't the one that destroys the opponent. It's the one that changes the rules of the game for everyone who comes after. And speaking of the next one, in our next video, an accountant who spent 11 years auditing the finances of a family-owned company. She was fired the same week she discovered something the owners desperately did not want anyone to know. The problem? She had already sent the report, and the recipient was not who they thought it was. Don't miss it. Unjust systems survive because the people they hurt believe they are alone. Calvin discovered he wasn't. When you stop carrying injustice in silence and start comparing it to other people's stories, you often discover that what felt personal was actually systemic, and systems can be challenged, especially when 14 people decide to walk up the courthouse steps together on a March morning. 3 stories today, and if you're anything like me, you're still thinking about all 3 of them. Rafael didn't announce his return. He let the wine speak first. And when Preston Hargrove went looking for the best vintage in Washington state, he found exactly who was behind it. Raymond didn't fight the investigation with emotion. He opened a folder he had been keeping for 22 years and made 17 phone calls. That's not luck. That's a life built with intention. And Calvin? Calvin took the worst Tuesday of his life and spent 10 years turning it into something that would protect the next person who walked through that door with a torn shoulder and a broken dream. Here's what I keep coming back to. None of these people waited for someone to hand them justice. They understood their situation completely. They used every legitimate tool available, and they were patient enough to wait for the right moment. That's not revenge. That's architecture. I'll see you in the next one. And trust me, you do not want to miss what that accountant found in those financial records.